Hello everyone, in this video I will show you a complete guide for the BELLSTRIKE Umbra Path, which consists of the Strategic Sword and Heavenquaker Spear martial arts. I will explain how to use the build in PvE, PvP, what stats to focus on when tuning and attuning gear, and some advanced tips and tricks. The Umbra Path is one of the best DPS builds in the game, especially for group content. It absolutely destroys any solo boss, but it has low survivability, so you need to be a bit careful not to die. It can struggle in group content where the enemy is moving a lot, as most of the skills require the target to stay in place. The playstyle revolves around buffing your damage with the Heavenquaker Spear, applying bleed stacks to the enemy using your Strategic Sword, and consuming them to deal massive amounts of damage. You can only apply a maximum of 5 bleed stacks on a target, so the idea is to keep consuming and reapplying them for massive damage. Whenever you consume 5 stacks of bleed, this will be referred to as dealing a high amount of damage, so keep this in mind throughout the video, because we will be referencing this very often. This is a pretty easy to play build and it feels very smooth as well, allowing you to move around the battlefield constantly and dash towards and away from the enemy. This build focuses on dealing affinity hits as opposed to critical hits, so your tuning attributes will be focusing towards achieving a high affinity rate and max physical attack. What exactly are affinity hits and how can we differentiate them from the other type of hits in the game? Affinity hits are similar to critical hits, except they deal a fixed amount of damage which is always based on your maximum physical attack and maximum BELLSTRIKE attack, while critical hits will deal variable damage based on your min and max physical attack. You can identify an affinity hit by the orange color of the damage number, whereas critical hits are yellow, a normal hit is white, and an abrasion hit is grey. As opposed to critical hits, affinity hits can be triggered by any type of attack, not just precision hits, and the damage of an affinity hit deals 35% more damage than a normal hit at base, and with this build it can be increased to almost 100% more damage. Affinity rate as opposed to critical rate is kept at 40% against enemies of level 81 or higher, which we will unlock in the next season, which starts next week, and you can increase it further up to 50% through direct affinity rate. We'll talk more about stats and gear later in the video. The Strategic Sword will be your main DPS martial art, and the Heavenquaker Spear will be used for buffing up your damage while also excelling in PvP scenarios. Let's start off with briefly explaining what each martial art does. First off, your main martial art will be the Strategic Sword, which uses the sword weapon class. The inner track / skill makes you dash to the enemy and apply up to 5 stacks of bleed by pressing the button continuously. This will be your main gap closer skill. It has a long cooldown and costs 0 stamina to use. The Inner Balance Strike 3 skill makes you dash backwards and deal multiple slashes in an area in front of you, while also applying 4 stacks of bleed. If the enemy has 5 stacks of bleed when you use this skill, it will consume all stacks to deal a high amount of damage. This skill is on a 1 second cooldown, so you can spam it whenever you want if you have enough stamina. Lastly, we have the Charge skill Second Track Slash, which makes you dash forward and deal massive damage to all enemies in your path, while inflicting up to 5 stacks of bleed if you let the skill animation finish. The skill can be charged up to phase 1 or 2, and the more you charge it, the more damage it deals. During this slash, you are untargetable and immune to damage. This will be your secondary gap closing skill, which you can use to get close to the enemy while your inner track slash is on cooldown. Now let's look at the martial arts talents, which are extremely important. First, we have the Bleed Mechanism Enhancement talent. When a special skill hits an enemy, if the target has 5 stacks of bleed, it will consume them to deal a high amount of damage while restoring 10 stamina. Your special skill is the Inner Balance Strike 3, which already has the effect of consuming bleed, but with this talent you also get stamina back when doing that. The Affinity Rate Up talent gives you bonus affinity rate based on your power attribute, and it reaches the maximum value when you get 150 power. The Bleed Penetration Enhancement talent gives you bonus physical and BELLSTRIKE penetration based on your maximum physical attack attribute, and it reaches the maximum at 1500 max physical attack. The other two talents are the same as for any path. One gives you BELLSTRIKE attack and penetration based on your max BELLSTRIKE attack, and the other makes your skills deal bonus damage based on your BELLSTRIKE attack. So, to recap, the Strategic Sword will be your main DPS martial art, which applies and consumes bleed stacks constantly, allowing you to deal a ton of DPS. Let's move on to the Heavenquaker Spear martial art, which will provide us with various damage increasing buffs. First, we have the Sober Sorrow skill. You spin the spear around you, performing 6 hits and dealing massive damage. After the skill ends, you get one of 3 buffs depending on how many combo hits you achieve. At 5 or fewer hits you gain Water Drop, at 5 or more hits you gain Spring Surge, and at 10 or more hits you gain River Flow. Water Drop gives you 10% HP damage, Spring Surge gives you 15%, and River Flow gives you 20%. This means that if you use this skill perfectly, you can get a 20% HP damage buff that lasts 12 seconds. Next we have the Sweeping All skill. This makes you spin the spear to deal damage to nearby enemies, and it becomes enhanced according to which buff you have active from your Sober Sorrow skill. If you have Water Drop, it will deal moderate damage. If you have Spring Surge, it will have even more damage and attack range, while also reducing the target's defense by 25% for players and 5% for non-players. If you have River Flow, the skill has even more damage and range, reduces the target's defense and also applies bleed. This skill is clearly PvP focused due to the massive defense reduction on player units, but in PvE it's simply not worth using for boss fights because the animation is too long and you only get 5% defense reduction, which is not a lot. The debuff also does not last very long, only 10 seconds. However, it's a very good skill for clearing mobs in PvE as it does great AoE damage, and with the Wolfchaser's art upgraded to tier 4, it will also restore a good amount of health. Lastly, we have the most important skill for the spear, which is the heavy charge attack, Drifting Thrust. This skill does nothing on its own, but paired with the martial art talent Damage Over Time, it applies the Soul Shaken debuff, which increases the damage over time of your bleed by 10% and the high bleed damage when consuming it by 10%. It stacks up to 5 times and lasts 15 seconds. This means you get a total of 50% more bleed damage and 50% more consume damage if you hit enemies 5 times with your charged heavy attack. The physical attack up talent gives you bonus max physical attack based on your power attribute, reaching the maximum bonus at 150 power. The damage over time talent gives you affinity damage based on your max physical attack, up to 30% at 1500 max physical attack. The other two talents are the same as for any path. One gives you BELLSTRIKE damage bonus based on your max BELLSTRIKE attack, and the other makes your skills deal bonus damage based on your BELLSTRIKE attack. As you can see, the Heavenquaker Spear can provide us with a 20% HP damage buff, a 50% bleed damage increase, and a 50% bleed consuming damage increase. It's a bit difficult to include the spear in your rotation, but once you learn how to do it, your overall DPS will increase considerably. The main idea behind the skill rotation for this build is to apply and consume bleed as often as possible and to use your spear skills only during moments where you are left with one or more bleed stacks on the enemy in order to ensure you don't interrupt your bleed consuming rotation and that you maintain the damage boost from the spear. Before we can talk about combos and playstyle, we need to look at the inner ways for the Umbra Path, which drastically change the way you play the build. The Sword Horizon inner way is the bread and butter of this build, and it allows you to perform a follow-up attack which is called Crosswind Blade after you use your martial art skill, special skill or charge skill. The skill description says you have to press the skill button at the perfect timing, but you can just spam the button and you will perform this attack guaranteed. Performing Crosswind Blade on a target with 5 stacks of bleed will consume the stacks and deal high bleed damage. This essentially allows all of your skills to consume bleed, not just your inner balance strike. This is a massive buff as you can apply 5 stacks of bleed with your inner track slash, and using the follow-up attack allows you to also consume them immediately. At tier 1 you get 8 endurance back whenever you perform a Crosswind Blade attack. At tier 3 the inner way gains a massive buff by making a new resource bar appear above your strategic sword icon in the HUD. This new resource is called Crosswind Blade Spirit, and you can charge it by dealing high bleed damage, meaning whenever you consume bleed from a target. When this bar is full, the next Crosswind Blade follow-up attack you perform is guaranteed to be an affinity hit, which is massive since this build is all about dealing affinity hits and they deal very high damage. At tier 4 you get a 15% damage increase whenever you consume bleed while the Crosswind Blade bar is not empty, which is almost all the time. At tier 6 when you consume bleed from a target and the Crosswind Blade bar is not empty, you will retain 1 stack of bleed. Also at tier 6 you will get 20 Crosswind Blade Spirit back whenever you consume bleed while at full Crosswind Blade Spirit. This pairs well with the tier 4 upgrade, allowing you to have a permanent 15% damage increase when consuming bleed. As you can see, with this inner way you have to constantly spam your skill buttons in order to consume bleed as often as possible and increase your DPS by a huge amount. The Wolfchaser's art Inner Way is designed for the Heavenquaker Spear, and what it does is reduce the combo required to grant the buffs from 510 to 48, which is massive. Additionally, if you hit an enemy which has bleed stacks, you gain a 60, 70, 80, 90 or 100% chance to add an extra combo count when performing the skill. Since the skill deals a total of 6 hits and your goal is to reach 8, that's why you should only use it on targets that have at least one bleed stack on them to have a high chance of reaching 8 combo count and get the 20% HP damage buff. At tier 1, the duration of the damage buff from Sober Sorrow is increased to 15 seconds. At tier 3, you deal 10% more damage and you also get 60% damage reduction and interruption resistance during the skill. At tier 4, when you reach combo count 10, you gain a different buff which is called Potent Flowing River, giving you 25% more damage and makes your sweeping all skill heal you for 20% of the damage dealt. At tier 6, hitting a target that has the Soul Shaken debuff, which is applied by your Spear Charge skill, will apply another stack of Soul Shaken. Hitting the same target 5 times within 3 seconds, it applies a debuff called Wine Goo, which makes the target take 5% more damage from all sources for 15 seconds. Overall, this Inner Way increases the damage buffs from your spear by a great amount and makes you stack your debuffs quicker. Moving on to Insightful Strike, which makes you generate focus when dealing affinity damage. When focus is full, you enter the concentration state for 10 seconds, which increases your affinity damage by 10% and affinity rate by 3%. When you get hit during concentration, there is a 5% chance to reduce the damage taken by 40%. At tier 1, you heal for 1.5% of the damage dealt while in concentration state. At tier 3, you get 3% affinity rate while in concentration state. At tier 4, focus accumulates 50% faster. At tier 6, all of your bleed damage is increased by 20% while in concentration. This Inner Way is an insane damage increase and it's very easy to trigger just by dealing affinity damage, which is another reason why this build focuses on affinity hits and less on critical hits. Our fourth Inner Way is Morale Chant, simply because it's one of the best Inner Ways at lower tiers, because it gives you 5% damage increase, 5% healing increase, and 10 physical penetration just by dealing damage. We are not using Adaptive Steel simply because the tier 0 effect is just too weak. It applies one stack of bleed once every 6 seconds when dealing affinity damage, which is nowhere close to being as good as a permanent 5% damage buff. The tier 1 and 3 upgrades for Adaptive Steel are also pretty useless, especially in PvE, and even the tier 4 and 6 upgrades are not that great. You might want to change Morale Chant for Wildfire Spark once you get enough materials to upgrade it to tier 3 or 4, since this build consumes a ton of endurance and you will often run out. Using Wildfire Spark allows you to spam your skills without worrying too much about endurance. Now that we finished talking about Inner Ways, it's time to see what the most optimal combos are for both PvE and PvP. The most optimal DPS combo for PvE goes like this. Start off by using your inner track slash, and when you reach 5 bleed stacks, press the parry button to cancel the animation. Immediately switch to your spear and use the Sober Sorrow skill. When you reach 8 combo hits, press the parry button to cancel the animation, because you only need 8 hits for the maximum damage bonus. Start charging your heavy attack and release it immediately when you see the indicator. When you reach 5 stacks of Soul Shaken, immediately cancel it using the parry button. Switch back to your sword and use your special skill, and keep spamming the button to use the follow-up attack and consume bleed. When you dash past the enemy, as soon as you reach behind them, press the parry button to cancel the animation. Use the special skill again and repeat the animation cancelling step. After you use it 3 times in a row, after cancelling the animation, immediately use the Soaring Spin Mystic skill. After the skill does the second hit, immediately cancel the animation using the parry button. Use your inner track slash skill again until you reach 5 bleed stacks, then cancel the animation using the parry button. Switch to your spear, but this time start with your charged attack, because the enemy will still have 5 stacks of Soul Shaken on them. Only hit them once and immediately cancel the animation, which will reset the stacks back to full duration. Use your Sober Sorrow skill and cancel the animation when you reach 8 combo hits. Switch back to your sword and start spamming the special skill again using the animation cancelling process. Keep repeating this combo over and over again and you should get the maximum possible DPS. If you are struggling to do the animation cancelling consistently, you can do the same combo just without the animation cancelling and it will still be very effective. You can also use your Dragon's Breath plus Drunken Poet combo instead of Soaring Spin, which will give you similar DPS overall. Now there will be a small change in your combo once you upgrade your Wolfchaser's art inner weight to tier 4 and tier 6. At tier 4 you will need to ensure that you reach 10 combo hits with your Sober Sorrow Spear skill to get an even better HP damage buff. For this reason you want to make sure you use it when the enemy has at least 3 or 4 stacks of bleed on them to guarantee 10 hits. At tier 6 your Sober Sorrow will now apply stacks of Soul Shaken if the enemy already has at least 1 stack on them. For this reason your spear combo will now change to charge attack into immediate cancel with the Sober Sorrow, which will get you from 1 Soul Shaken stack to 5. This will make the combo much faster than before because you won't waste as much time with the charged attack. If you're fighting certain boss enemies that deal a ton of damage and you're struggling to survive, you can switch your inner balance strike with a charge skill second track slash instead. It also applies a good number of bleed stacks and you can consume them. The difference is that it makes you immune to damage during the skill dash animation, so if you keep spamming this you will have a large invincibility window. This is especially strong in PvP scenarios. The PvP combo is pretty similar to the PvE one, except now you want to avoid using certain attacks that have a long animation, because PvP is all about dealing damage fast and avoiding getting caught up in a stagger combo by the enemy. You also want to use your spear more often in PvP, because it deals more stagger damage and makes you more resistant to stagger. You should start off with the inner track slash again, but do not consume the bleed. After applying the 5 bleed stacks, quickly switch to your spear and use the Sober Sorrow skill to deal high amount of stagger damage and get your 20% damage buff. Use the Sweep All skill to deal a ton of damage and reduce the enemy's defense by 25%. In PvP, do not use the charge attack unless you are 100% sure you can land it, because it has a very short range and a long wind-up animation, so it will miss most of the time, unless you use it when the enemy is coming in to deal damage. Remember that the Sober Sorrow skill gives you 60% damage reduction and stagger resistance, so you can use it freely in PvP, and your charge skill also gives you Fortitude, meaning you're immune to quad control during it. Instead of spamming your inner balance strike, for PvP it's better to mix in your second track slash as well, as it consumes less stamina and gives you invincibility frames. Only charge it once when the enemy is far away from you to avoid getting interrupted, and make sure to always use the follow-up attack because it makes you dash straight to the enemy. Only use inner balance strike when you have plenty of stamina and when the enemy is very close to you to ensure you don't miss it, and always use the follow-up attack as well. For mystic skills we have the following recommendations for PvE. Golden Body for damage reduction, Ghost Bind for stunning enemies and keeping them in place to avoid taking damage, Dragon's Breath plus Drunken Poet has a high DPS damaging combo against boss enemies, Meridian Touch, Celestial Seas, and Cloud Steps to deal with various boss mechanics. For PvP mystic skills we have the following recommendations. Serene Breeze to get out of stagger, Cloud Steps as a gap closer, Dragon's Breath plus Drunken Poet as a damaging combo, Free Morph as a stagger skill that also deals a ton of damage, Soaring Spin as a quick damage and staggering skill with low cost, and Yaksha Rush as a low cost knock-up that breaks the target's defense and applies silence. Now it is time to move to the gear tab and talk about item sets, tuning attributes and more. First off, obviously we will want to use the BELLSTRIKE arsenal, and for Divinecraft the recommended ones are fire or poison because they deal more damage than water. When it comes to gear sets, the recommended ones happen to be the best ones for this build. For the weapons and accessories set, the Hawkwing set is clearly the best one. Not only does it give you affinity rate, but whenever you trigger affinity, which will be very often, you gain the Hawkwing buff, which increases your physical attack by 2% for 5 seconds, up to 5 times. That's a 10% physical attack buff that you can maintain all the time. For the armor set, the best one is easily the Eagle Rise set. Whenever you deal damage over time, which means all the time since we are applying bleed, you gain 1 stack of Eagle Rise, which reduces damage taken by 1.2% for 10 seconds, stacking up to 5 times. That means 6% damage reduction at all times. When you reach max stacks of Eagle Rise, you gain the Eagle Guard effect, reducing damage of the next hit you take within 10 seconds by 90% or 45% when it comes from a boss. This effect can only trigger once every 30 seconds. This is a massive damage reduction buff every 30 seconds, which is great. Overall, since the goal with this build is to deal affinity damage as much as possible, you will maintain the effects of both Hawkwing and Eagle Rise non-stop. Now let's talk about the actual tuning and the tuning attributes we should look for on our gear. When it comes to tuning, all items can roll the same attributes and it's all random. You cannot control what attribute rolls, you can only control its rarity or its value range. How do we know which attributes are important for our build? The answer is pretty simple. We just need to go back and look at our talents and our skills and playstyle and see what stats they are focusing on. In our case, for the BELLSTRIKE Umbra path, we need the following minimum attributes to reach 100% efficiency on our talents: 150 power, 1500 max physical attack, and 334 max BELLSTRIKE attack. If we look at our martial arts inner ways and overall build playstyle, we can see that the core idea of the build is to apply and consume bleed as often as possible while buffing ourselves with our spear. We can also notice that our item sets and some of the inner ways require us to deal affinity damage, and in turn they boost our affinity rate and affinity damage. In order to take advantage of all these effects, we will need to ensure we have as much affinity rate as possible and as much max physical attack as possible without sacrificing precision rate and critical rate. Even though our main focus is dealing affinity damage, we also don't want to fall into the trap of having 0 precision rate and 0 critical rate attributes on our items, because then we will be dealing too many normal hits, which means we lose a ton of DPS. This build is very difficult to min-max because you need a good balance between affinity rate, precision rate, critical rate, and max physical or BELLSTRIKE attack. The priority order for your tuning attributes on all gear pieces should be the following. The first and most important attribute which you want to have on every single gear piece is momentum. Why? Because momentum is the best way to gain affinity rate besides the actual affinity rate attribute. Remember that you want to get as close to 40% affinity rate as possible. Every 1 point of momentum will give you 0.04% affinity rate and 0.9 max physical attack, so you are getting 2 of the most important stats just from this one attribute. You want to try and get momentum on all of your gear pieces and only stop when you reach 40% affinity rate. Next we have affinity rate, which is the best way to get our affinity rate to 40%. You want to roll this on every single gear piece unless you already have 40% affinity rate. Next you want to roll power until you reach 150 and then stop in order to achieve 100% efficiency for the affinity rate up and physical attack up talents. Power also gives you 1.4 max physical attack, so it's a great attribute on its own. Then you want to get max physical attack until you reach 1500 to reach maximum efficiency for the bleed penetration enhancement and damage over time enhancement talents. Next you want to get 334 max BELLSTRIKE attack in order to reach 100% efficiency for the BELLSTRIKE attribute up talents. After you are done with reaching 100% on all of your talents, for the remainder of your tuning slots you should focus on precision rate until you reach 100% and then critical rate as much as possible. Once you reach the 1500 max physical attack and 334 max BELLSTRIKE attack thresholds, you should continue rolling max BELLSTRIKE attack in any available slot. This is how an ideal min-maxed gear set would look like for the BELLSTRIKE Umbra path. Momentum on all 8 gear slots, affinity rate on all 8 gear slots, power on 3 or 4 gear slots depending on how much you need to reach 150, precision rate on 4 or 5 gear slots depending on how much you need to reach 100, max BELLSTRIKE and max physical attack rolls on various gear pieces until you reach the required thresholds for the talents. All the other slots should be filled with critical rate and max BELLSTRIKE attack. Your goal is to reach the affinity cap, reach 100% efficiency on all talents, then reach 100% precision rate and then as much critical rate as possible. You want to be dealing only affinity hits and critical hits with as few normal hits as possible. When comparing max BELLSTRIKE attack and max physical attack, keep in mind that BELLSTRIKE attack scales your damage much better than max physical attack, so prioritize that over max physical attack when comparing gear pieces. Remember that you can check the value ranges for each attribute by going to the affix preview screen. Also note that all of these values will keep increasing the higher the level of your gear, so when the next season starts all of these will go up by a large amount, meaning you will be able to reach your attribute caps much easier. For attunement attributes priority for PvE, there's not much to say. For weapons you want to prioritize BELLSTRIKE penetration, then physical penetration. Anything else is unacceptable. For armor and accessories you want to roll Strategic Sword martial arts skill damage boost on all 6 slots, or at least Strategic Sword special skill damage boost. Anything else is unacceptable because we will not be using our spear as a damage dealing weapon, and we will not be using the charge attack of the sword too much. For arena attunement attributes, prioritize the following. On both weapons, get the effect that restores 30 vitality and 20% HP when using an execution skill. On the disc, get the effect which restores endurance when hitting the same target 3 or more times with your inner balance strike. On the pendant, get the effect which makes your second track slash knock exhausted enemies airborne. On the helmet, get the effect which increases your HP and chi damage by 20% for 5 seconds when using any control removing skill, which is Serene Breeze. On the armor, get reduced damage taken when staggered. On the bracers, get chi damage increased by consecutive deflections. On the greaves, get the effect which restores chi after dodging an enemy attack. Now it's time for some advanced tips and tricks. Always keep an eye on the enemy debuffs and your own buffs. You want to have a clean skill rotation to always maintain 5 Soul Shaken stacks on the enemy and River Flow on yourself. The damage of your bleed stacks will depend on the source that applied the bleed. For example, the damage of the bleed stacks applied by Inner Track Slash is higher than the damage of the bleed stacks applied by your special skill and charge skill. The damage of the bleed stacks applied by the Sweep All Spear skill is also higher than the ones applied by your Inner Track Slash. You can test this yourself in the training room. Remember that when you are spamming your combo with the Strategic Sword, you can do 4 inner balance strikes in a row until your Inner Track Slash comes off cooldown, so be prepared to use it. If you find yourself very low on stamina and your Inner Track Slash is on cooldown, simply start spamming second track slash which consumes very little stamina and never charge it at the second level, just the first one. Remember that the Sober Sorrow Spear skill gives you 60% damage reduction and makes you immune to stagger, so don't be afraid to cast it into some huge boss attack or while the enemy parry is attacking you, because you will mitigate most of the damage. Your second track slash has a very long attack animation, and if you let it finish without using the follow-up attack, it will deal a lot of hits and apply 5 stacks of bleed. You are not always forced to use the follow-up attacks of your skills. For example, let's say you just want to use your inner balance strike to dash backwards and deal damage. You don't have to press the follow-up attack button to go back in, you can just let the skill finish and it will perform its basic attack variation, which still deals a good amount of damage. For PvP especially, it is ideal to time your inner balance strikes or second track slashes, such that you dash to or past the enemy when they are about to attack you. This way you can dodge a lot of their attacks while still dealing damage. This build has a ton of mobility, so take advantage of that. It's a relatively easy build to play once you get used to the skill rotation. Hopefully this video has helped you understand how the Umbra path works and how to maximize your DPS if you're using this build. For my next video I will do a guide on one of the 4 remaining paths, not exactly sure which. Leave a comment below if you want to see a guide for a specific build path, and let me know if you have any other tips and tricks for the BELLSTRIKE Umbra path. That would be it for this video, and if you found this information helpful, please consider liking and subscribing. Thanks for watching and I'll see you in the next one.